everyone, welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan and today we're going to be starting our how to build a Ford small block series. So this Ford small block series is going to cover a Ford 302 from 1980 or so. A lot of Ford small blocks are pretty darn similar. They made this block from, I believe, the early 70s or late 60s all the way up into the mid 90s, I believe. Because this is a Ford 302 Windsor, so if you have one of those, this video series will apply to you, and this is going to go very in depth. I am going to hold your hand the entire time. There is going to be nothing left to mystery by the end of this series, just like our Big Block Chevy video series and our Summit sponsored LS 5.3 video series. So speaking of sponsors, this video series is also sponsored by Summit Racing. They are the best in the business. If you haven't checked out Summit Racing, please go check them out. Link down below in the description. Buy all your speed parts from summitracing.com. So today's video, we're going to be taking the intake manifold and front accessories and the heads off of our small block Ford. Sometimes that's called top ending an engine. That's what we're doing today. We're taking the top end off. So that's going to be today's video. The next one we will be removing the rotating assembly and getting it down to the block and off to the machine shop. But today's job is pretty easy and straightforward. This is something you could definitely do in your own garage with basic hand tools. It is very, very simple, very approachable. So I want to go over a little bit of personal details I have with this engine. I've been familiar with this engine for about 10 years or so. If you want to skip all this personal jibber jabber, here is a time code and you can just advance to that and skip over. Thank you for not skipping over. That's pretty cool. So the story of this engine actually begins way back in the 80s. My best friend's mom bought this truck, a 1981 Bronco, I believe when she was 16 or 18, something like that, and drove it into oblivion. I mean, she just drove it and drove it and drove it, which is super, super cool, and she held on to it forever and ever. Fast forward a couple years, I meet this guy in high school, we became buddies, and we took auto shop, and being 16 or so, 15 or 16, we kind of thought we knew what we were doing, so we decided to start playing around with a Ford Bronco that was in his mom's driveway that, we had no business wrenching on. So we decided to take the carburetor off and monkey with a bunch of other things that really didn't need it. I mean, we were 16, we were just kids, and we didn't really know what we were doing and stuff. So technically, this is the first engine I ever worked on, because before that, I never worked on engines. I did oil changes and stuff, but I'm not gonna count that. This is the first engine I've ever done anything significant to. I'm kind of taking off the carburetor. I was 16, grading on a curve here. So it's pretty cool that, and then it sat, and fast forward, 15 years later or so to now, and now we get to take this thing apart and build it into a really cool street engine. And his mom actually just recently gave the Bronco to him, because she doesn't want it anymore, so now it's his. So now I get to take it apart and rebuild it and do it right. So pretty cool. And also I want to mention that this build is going to be a mild street build. This isn't going to be some big fire-breathing monster. This is probably going to be a pretty hot Ford 302, probably shooting right around 430 horsepower if I had to just take a wild guess. We're probably going to put the compression at about 11 to 1 or so, and I think we're going to go EFI even. So this is going to be a little more advanced than a standard rebuild, so if you are doing a standard rebuild, I will try to do my best to point out where you're going to use stock components, where we're going to use really cool aftermarket stuff. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. So this is our 302 out of our 81 Bronco. These are available out of a bunch of different Fords, basically from the 60s into the 90s. It's a 302 Windsor, and we have it secured on our load leveler in 4 different places with some beefy washers, lifted up with our engine crane, because the first thing we need to do to put it on engine stand is to remove the flex plate and the block plate. So we can grab a 3/4 inch socket on an impact gun and remove these. Now, if you didn't have an impact gun, you're going to need to find a way to hold the engine on the front or the rear here. They actually make special tools that hold the ring gear, so you can get like a big breaker bar on there. But if you have an impact gun, you should be able to just buzz them off. Now these bolts are pretty darn special. Hold on to these, put them somewhere safe, somewhere you'll remember, maybe in a labeled Ziploc. And there we go, we can just remove our flex plate and hold on to that. We might reuse that in the future. It's kind of a non-wear item. If the ring gear teeth are all chewed up and ruined, you're gonna need to replace it, but this one honestly looks like it's in good shape. We'll probably just clean it up and reuse it. And then our block plate should just come off. Might need some persuasion. There we go. And hold on to this too. It's another non-wear item. We'll probably just clean it up and reuse it just like the flex plate. So now we can focus on getting the engine actually on the stand, and to do that we're gonna first start with this apparatus here. We're gonna let the arms be loose, but the nut and bolts are still finger tight so it doesn't just fall off on us. We want to do that so we can adjust the arms accordingly, how we want the bell housing pattern to line up. And to affix the apparatus to the engine, we have these bolts. These are 7/16, and that's a 14 thread count, and they're 4 inches long, and I've backed them up with some very, very beefy washers. And we can just put that through each of the arms. You can see how far they're gonna go into the engine, at least a full inch, maybe a bit more. So that's plenty of threads. You just wanna make sure you have at least an inch worth of threads into the engine. The thing weighs probably around 500 pounds, and you really don't want that hanging on just a couple of threads. You want plenty of meat on these bolts. So we can grab our first bolt and arm and begin putting this thing on. When we're tightening down our bolts here, these 4 bolts, pick up the apparatus a little bit so it's a little more centered in between where the camshaft is and the crankshaft is. This will make rotating the engine over later on a lot easier because the center of gravity will be a little more centered. And then we can tighten down the big bolts. Just gonna go around again and tighten these down. They're pretty big bolts, so make sure they've got plenty of tightness on them, and they're going into cast iron, so don't be shy. So this is what it should look like when you're done. It is basically, this hole here is basically perfectly between where the crankshaft and camshaft are, and this is just going to make turning the engine over later a lot easier on us. So what a lot of people like to do at this point is they like to lower this down onto our engine stand. I don't really have the luxury because the engine crane feet and the engine stand feet don't play nice with each other. They will lay on top of each other, so it's not really an option for me. You could try doing it backward, but I really don't like doing that. What I prefer doing is just putting the stand onto the crane and engine all together, and then low leveling it, and then dropping it down and having it slide off the feet of the engine crane. So here's our situation. Again, these legs won't fit on the inside of our cherry picker's legs, so we're just gonna kind of have to deal with it, and as we lower it down, try to slide it off the front. I've done it a few times before, so it's nothing I'm not expecting. Go. Let her down like that. Sometimes when you're dealing with engine pulling tools like this, this stand is not made by the same manufacturer as the cherry picker, so they don't really know each other's specifications. So that's why it makes a lot of sense to buy your engine crane and engine stand together as one kit, because the manufacturer knows what the other thing is doing. So we can unhook our load leveler. And pull our engine out. Perfect. So if you have exhaust manifolds on your engine. Most of the time when it comes from a junkyard, they usually don't, but we pulled this ourselves, and it was a lot easier just to unbolt, you know, the 2 bolts over here rather than the 8 or so over here. So we're just gonna grab our 9/16 and remove these bolts. You might want to hold on to these bolts if you're going to use this exhaust manifold again. We are not, so I can go ahead and toss these because our new ones are going to come with our new headers, which is what we're going to be putting on. You might want to keep track of which bolt comes out of which hole as well, because you can see that this distance is longer than this distance, so these bolts are shorter and these bolts are longer. Just something to keep in mind, just in case you are going to be reusing the stock stuff. We are not. And then with our last one, go ahead and support the manifold and remove it with the gasket. Perfect. Now the cool thing is the passenger side is exactly the same as the driver's side, so like we did on the passenger side, do that on the driver's side. So the next thing we're going to worry about is removing our front accessories, and I'm going to start with our power steering pump, just because they're usually the most difficult, because you have to remove the pulley off of there. And the reason you might want to do that is so you can keep the bracketry, because the bracketry is usually reusable. You can just you know, sandblast it or scrub it clean and shoot it with a new coat of paint. It'll be good to go. Alternatively, you could just remove these 3 bolts, 4 bolts if you count the adjuster, but I already have that one removed, and you could remove the entire bracket and set it aside and buy new stuff and put it on later and worry about that later. But I'm most likely going to reuse this bracket. I'm not sure yet, so I'm going to remove the pulley, and then I can remove the pump, and then I can keep the bracket and maybe rebuild it later. So I have my power steering pump puller on. Just going to install that, make sure it is nice and snug. Make sure it's nice and square and it's not just gonna flop off of there. Looks perfect. And make sure that the threads are nice and lubricated like this one is. With our threads nice and lubricated, we can grab an inch wrench to hold the tool and a 1/2 inch on our impact gun. Now you could use a ratchet and do it old school, but let's try the electric implement first. Just like that. Perfect. See, as the tool presses on, it actually forces the pulley off of the shaft here. So, you know, you might want to buy one of these tools. I've left the link down below in the description. Also, you can rent them at AutoZone for free. Just make sure when you're using one of these tools to always wear eye protection. It's a lot of force and anything can happen. And we can just remove the tool from our pulley. And we can just remove the tool from our pulley. And I'm going to hold on to this pulley. It might be useful in the future. These don't really, you know, wear out because they're just spinning. The only thing you want to make sure is that it's not cracked or anything, which this one isn't. It's in perfect shape. I could probably just clean this up and reuse it. So we might be reusing it. I'm going to hold on to it. So now we can remove our power steering pump using an 11/16 socket. Just like that. Perfect. Now this power steering pump is original off of the truck. It's over 40 years old, so I'm just going to go ahead and toss it. If yours is in good shape, you might be able to get away reusing it, but we're not going to do that today. Now we can remove the piece I actually want to keep using a 9/16 socket. This one's 11/16. There we go. Perfect. Now hold on to this bracket, because like I said, they can be a little tricky to find sometimes. And brackets don't really go out unless they're cracked or something. I can just repaint this and reuse it. Now we can remove our alternator, but again, keeping our brackets. I already removed the bottom bolt, it's a 9/16, I believe, just like the top, but we're gonna have to back up the top with a wrench. There we go. Hold the bottom of the alternator, and then remove our alternator. Again, if yours is in shape, maybe consider reusing it, but this one is absolutely junk. I'm not even gonna chance it, especially because you're gonna see how awesome this build turns out. I don't wanna put this rusty thing back on there. Next, we can focus on removing our massive, outdated AC compressor, and we can remove the bracket bolts. The bottom one is 5/8. And we can remove these top bolts, 9/16. wiggle that forward. So where this AC compressor was, that is a absolutely massive gargantuan R12 unit. Totally outdated. You can go ahead and toss it. You might want to hold on to the bracketry that was underneath it that actually mounted it to the cylinder head right here. But other than that, I would toss that unit and upgrade to a R134A unit. Okay, so now we can remove the AC belt tensioner and bracket. I'm just gonna remove it all together with a 9/16 socket. Again, hold on to these brackets because you can reuse them. So the cool thing for us is that the water pump is really only held on with bolts and this one tube going from the top of the water pump to the thermostat housing. So we can just cut through that, no problem. Now I can worry about bolts. So the first bolt I'm gonna remove is the little 3/8 one because I don't want all the pressure being applied to this little tiny bolt. And again, you might want to hold on to these and kind of denote which hole they all came out of, but we're going to buy brand new. We're definitely not putting this gross water pump back in. And then the rest of the bolts, I believe, are 1/2 inch. It seems like almost every single bolt is a different length. It's interesting. And over here on the left, we have the sweep for our alternator tension. So I'm going to hold on to this bracket for later. Ah, that's an interesting bolt. Might want to hold on to these. These are weird bolts, man. Watch your fingers when you remove this. Looks like somebody RTV'd it in the past, so this water pump probably went out at some point in this engine's life. It's not too surprising. We can just remove that unit, and I'm going to go ahead and toss it right in the trash because we're going to get a new one. Now we can grab our 9/16 socket and remove our alternator bracket. There we go, and again, hold on to this, we can reuse it later. The next thing we're going to do is remove our fuel pump by removing those two 9/16 bolts that hold it to the engine. There's one, there's two. There we go. And we can just go ahead and remove this. Now I'm just going to go ahead and throw this fuel pump away. I happen to know that it doesn't work because someone cut it off and stopped using it, pinched it shut years ago, so that tells me this thing hasn't worked in a long time, which is fine because we're most likely going to use an electric fuel pump in the future, and we'll just put a nice plate right over this, and that will be that. So I'm going to toss this. And if you were going to use mechanical fuel pump on the rebuild, don't reuse this fuel pump, get a new one. Now we can remove our thermostat housing, and because of this flange, it is going to be a little more tedious, 1/2 inch wrench, and we're just going to sit here and loosen this bolt. There we go, a little tedious, but not too bad. Now we can remove the other 1/2 inch bolt. That was a lot easier. And just remove the housing, just like that. Might want to be careful, there might be some more icky, see down in there, some icky water. And you know what, I'm gonna hold on to the housing, I'm gonna throw the thermostat away, but I'm gonna hold on to the housing, might be able to clean this up and reuse it, I'm unsure. I'm gonna have to take a wire brush to it. But it might be savable, so I'm gonna hold on to it. So now we're gonna remove our main drive pulley on the end of the harmonic damper, and that's a 9/16 bolts. And hold on to these bolts, they're pretty special, so we can reuse those no problem. There we go, all 4 of those are removed. Might require some persuading. Plastic hammer, very cool. And again, hold on to this. We could probably just wire brush this, shoot it with a new coat of paint, and it'll be as good as new. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put these 9/16 bolts back, and I'll show you why in just a minute. A, so I don't lose them, which is a real problem when you're rebuilding an engine. But B, it gives us the ability to turn the engine over pretty easily. So with those bolts in place, you can turn the engine over pretty easy. See? And that's because our engine is all locked up. If your engine's locked up, don't try this because you'll just snap these 9/16 bolts off. But our engine's turning like an absolute cupcake. See? So that's pretty cool. Remember this when we're taking pistons out because we're going to need to turn the engine over in order to do that. Now we can remove our oil pressure sender using a 9/16 wrench. What I want you to do with this is just throw it right in the trash and buy a new one because you have no idea if it works or not, and believe me, when everything's assembled in the car, this is going to be an absolute bear to get to. And then to remove our tube here for the oil pressure sender, I'm going to use a large adjustable wrench. Spreads out the force a lot more evenly. And we can grab our 7/8 and finish this off. There we go, and I'm going to hold on to this just so I know what replacement part to get. This one's in pretty rough condition, so I'm going to hold on to it just in case we need it. I don't think we're going to need it just because it has this electrical sensor here, and we're probably not going to reuse that. We're probably going to go back to something a little more old school. So now we can take off our valve covers using a 7/16 deep well. And you can see that at one point this engine was blue and not just gross. It's interesting. Now you might want to hold on to these valve covers. They are original and in my opinion pretty cool. But if you are putting on a taller valve train, like if you had roller rockers, they might not fit. Or especially if you're using stud girdles, they guarantee won't fit with those. But you might want to hold on to them. Nostalgia's sake and all that. There we go. We can remove them. Might be a little stucky. Encouragement, because I guarantee these have never been off before. Oh yeah. There we go. And remove them. I have to say, it's not bad in there. I was expecting much worse. That is not too bad. I've seen a lot worse. Right on. The cool thing is the passenger side is exactly the driver's side, which we just removed, so do that for this other side as well. So now we can remove our load leveler. Sometimes I call it a tilty thing. You could remove this at any time that you wanted to, but since we're going to remove the intake manifold next, well, distributor then intake manifold, I decided to remove it now. We use a 1/2" socket. Remove our bolts here. And we can get that load leveler out of there. Next we can remove our distributor using a 1/2" wrench to get the hold down bolt out of there. And as far as this distributor goes, I would just get a new one. This one is, I don't believe it's the original one that came from Ford, because I don't think they came with Mallory ignition. They might have. Don't hold me to that. But this is a fairly old unit, and when I was testing it back when it was in the Bronco, the distributor was not firing. It could have been a coil, but I think the mag pickup in here, because I think that's what this has. Yeah, it has a mag pickup, doesn't have points. I think that's just gone dead. Might be able to restore that. Hold on to this hold down piece for the distributor. You could probably clean that up and reuse it, no problem. And then we can just pull our distributor straight up. Just like that. Might fight you a little bit. There we go. Perfect. And like I said, I am probably just going to toss this, or I might turn it into a drive for the oil pump, like an oil priming tool. I might turn this into that. That'd be cool. And then we can use our 1/2" socket to remove the rest of the bolts. Once we're sure all of the bolts are removed, we can go ahead and lift straight up on our intake manifold, just breaking that seal, because in all likelihood this intake manifold has never been off this engine before since its assembly back in the 80s. So it might take a little bit of convincing. There we go. Now this intake manifold is nothing special. This is just a 2-barrel dual plane intake manifold. Basically junk made out of cast iron, so it weighs a ton. And it's 2-barrel. How lame is that? You don't want that. Nobody wants that. Unless you're doing like a super stock for stock rebuild where you want it to be absolutely perfectly original. I say toss these things or sell them if you really want to, but I can't see anybody wanting one. Ooh. Ooh. Well. So it's not every day that something jumps out at me this significantly, but you can see this engine's been hydrolocked at some point. So these 2 pistons have had water in them, probably a blown head gasket filling it on up. And then they tried starting it and it found the weakest point, which is the push rod here. So look, this push rod this one's bent and this one's bent on 2 and 3. So that is, that's kind of astonishing actually. I wonder if the connecting rods are bent too. Maybe not, because maybe this is where they found, you know, the point of least resistance. It's possible it just took all that out right on here. But yeah, at some point they tried to run this thing with water in it. Crazy. Next thing we're gonna do is remove our coolant crossover. Probably not going to reuse this. If we do, we'll probably just run an AN line. There we go. We're definitely not going to be reusing these stock heads because they are cast iron and very tiny intake runners. So, and it's not going to put the compression we want anyway, so we're not going to be reusing these stock heads, so keep that in mind when you're planning your build. So here is our Valvetrain. It is stock and standard. We can see the jiggliness of this one because of that bent push rod, so we can just remove everything. Now, you could save these and reuse these. These rocker arms don't typically go out because they're just stamped steel and there's really no moving parts, so you could reuse these if you really wanted to. I'm a big fan of just replacing everything, and we're not even going to be using these heads anyway, so I won't be keeping them, but it's something to keep in mind for your build. Now, since these aren't aluminum or anything, you don't really have to worry about galling the threads. So we can just grab a 1/2-inch socket and just removing them. And like I said, I will be tossing these because we're going to be using roller rockers in the future. And the cool thing about a roller rocker is the trunnion, which is this piece here, is actually a bearing. See, on here, it's just like a machine surface. On like a roller rocker, like on my big block or my RLS, it actually has a bearing in here, and then it also has a roller tip. See how this has no roller tip on the end? It's just metal. It works, it's fine, but you're gonna get more performance out of something with an actual bearing on the end of it. What I like to do too is hold on to one of the stock push rods. We are definitely not gonna be reusing these. I recommend don't reuse them. If you do reuse your Valvetrain, you have to put it back exactly the way you found it, which means that lifter has to go in that hole, this push rod has to go here in this orientation, and that rocker arm that I just removed has to go back on exactly the same position I removed it. So don't mix any of that up if you're doing like a super stock cheap rebuild. But even if you are doing aftermarket stuff like us, I like to hold on to one of these push rods. That way I can compare them against the new stuff to make sure we have the correct length and the geometry is all correct. And then we can just pull all our push rods out, except for this one. This one that looks like spaghetti. We're gonna have to take the head off in order to get this one out because it is all bent. Same with this one here. So these two we can leave in place until we remove our cylinder head. So the cool thing is, this is exactly the same as on the driver's side, so just do that for the other side as well. So now we can remove our cylinder head. What I like to do is go into a reverse spiral pattern. I mean, it's cast iron to cast iron. It's probably not super important, but it's a good habit to be in. And we're just going to take a 11/16 socket and begin removing our head bolts. Now, these are not torque to yield, so you could reuse them, but we're going to use ARP bolts for our future aluminum heads. And if you have aluminum heads, it might need different bolts, and it'll definitely have a different torque specification. So that just depends on what heads you're going to use. Remove all our bolts here again. We're going to be buying brand new bolts, so I'm not going to hold on to these. You might want to though. So what I'm going to do next is rotate the engine up so that the deck surface of the head is parallel to the ground. So that way when I remove the head, it doesn't just plunk right down onto my foot. What we can do is grab a long prying implement and put it on one of the sides of the head and make sure it doesn't just plop and fall off. They love to smash toes and they are very heavy, so be careful. There we go. Sometimes they can be really stuck like that. There we go. Already got one of those bent spaghetti push rods out. There we go. And there's our other bent spaghetti push rod. So this head's actually a little bit harder than the other head because the other head doesn't have any spaghetti push rods. So now we can remove our cylinder head. It's cast iron. It's pretty heavy, probably weighs 35 pounds, 40 pounds, something like that. And I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's pretty ungainly and it can smash your foot no problem. There we go. Remove that. Ooh, set that down. So we can actually look down inside the cylinder bore, and it's not too bad. I don't think there's any damage. That's good, as long as the block is okay. That's all we care about, as long as the block's okay. Now we can just do that for the other side. So this is what it should look like when you're done top ending your engine. We took everything off the top side of the engine. Next time we're gonna handle removing the rotating assembly and the lifters. These are pretty tricky to get out. You can kind of get this one out. It's going to be easier when we can get at it from the bottom. We'll just push the lifters up with our fingers. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. So that's how to take the top end off of a 302 Windsor Ford small block from 1980. Super cool engine. It's in pretty darn good shape, except for those bent push rods. Kind of funny. But what I think happened there is that it sat outside and water got into the bore. I don't think that it was a blown head gasket, just because I was told that the Bronco was stored with the hood off for quite a while, and I think that somebody maybe tried starting it. You know, rainwater gets down in there and it can't really go anywhere. You know, it doesn't go past the rings or anything, and then it hydrolock and compresses and stuff like that. So I think the block's going to be totally fine. I think that was actually a rainwater issue. Thank you so very much for watching. Thank you Summit Racing for sponsoring this build. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll catch you next time.